Hey, thank you, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come along this afternoon. It's genuinely a huge privilege, and to be the first in the series, well, the only way is up, really, isn't it? And it's absolutely fabulous to see such a enormous number of people in the room. I hadn't quite expected this many. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. And then if this isn't what you came to listen to, then feel free to sneak out now. I won't be in the least bit offended or hurt. But I'd really like to talk with you a bit about where I personally and Oxfam generally sees the humanitarian system going. And when I say the humanitarian system, I mean that in the broadest sort of systems thinking way. Anything and anybody who is committed to ensuring that when people, wherever they are, whoever they are faced with a set of circumstances which means that they simply cannot cope to get through the basics of the next few days, that's a humanitarian crisis. And when that happens, we all have a right to receive the assistance that we need to get through tomorrow. And that comes in a lot of different shapes, sizes, forms, and so on, doesn't it? But the best definition of humanitarianism that I've ever heard is simply that my problem is your problem because we are both human. And that's what humanitarianism is about. And I think we get very hung up on, is this about the United Nations system? Is this about the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement? Is it who's right? Whose system is it anyway? And it's actually not about that. It's about those people that you talk to the day after the earthquake, the day after, as I met people a couple of weeks ago who had walked for 7 days without stopping in South Sudan to get from where their lives were, where their businesses were, to stay with relatives hundreds of kilometres away because basically the conflict had turned them out of where they felt able to stay. And it's what works for them. And that's what we do. And how we do it is simply a means to fulfilling that basic right that we all have. So I'd like to talk with you a little bit about some of our ideas. They are things that we are in the course of developing, and this presentation in different ways, shapes and forms I've given in a number of different places this year, not because I can't think of another one to do, I'm sure I could, but because genuinely we'd like to hear what you think. There's more brain power in this room than I can really get my own head round. And the privilege of presenting this to you and asking you what you think is an enormous one for me. So what I'd like to say a little bit about in the next 45 minutes or so is the case for change. Why is it that the way humanitarian assistance is currently delivered, which is largely still by a group of predominantly northern-based non-government organisations, UN agencies, Red Cross organisations and donor governments, why that needs to change? It's not a choice, it's an imperative. How might it look in future? What, as one very small part of that humanitarian system, Oxfam's trying to do to change what we do and how we do it? And then some implications for all of us who are trying to work within that sector or are thinking about working in that sector in the future. So that's what I'm going to do. Does that work for you? Okay. And I'll talk, and I'll try and talk not for too long, and then what I'd really like to do, as I say, is have a real discussion about it. And that includes disagreeing. So please think of disagreements, okay? So, what's the case for change? It's always easy to argue for change's sake. And if you come from an organisation like mine that is in the business of change, then frankly it's far more difficult to make a case for standing still. But what's happening is, just in the time that I've been working in the humanitarian sector, which is since the early 1990s, it is almost impossible to underestimate the global economic and political balance and the way that that has shifted. From a very positive sense, the growth of the Asian economies, the growth of a middle class across Africa, but then the political balance that has also shifted, and the way that the sort of, if you like, those organisations who, certainly as Oxfam, we feel we are a global organisation. There are about 10,000 people who work for Oxfam worldwide, and less than 10% look like me, you know, and sound like me, i.e. white, middle-class British by origin. And yet we are still perceived by many as a northern-based British organisation. And we put a lot of time and effort into changing that, but it's still, and we feel the difference in how we are perceived and where we work and how we work. And that's just one very small example. So the shifting geopolitical and economic perspective on the world is very, very different than it was 25 years ago. And that drives access to humanitarian assistance by certain groups of people. For some, it's much easier, and for others, it's much more difficult. Whatever it is, it's different. That also means that the operating environment is much more difficult and very much more complex. The possibility at the moment that we are balancing is we work in support of people affected by the crisis in Syria, in Lebanon and in Jordan. We are based currently in Damascus because we feel we can reach more people working from that side and work cross-line, across the conflict lines while based in Damascus than we could based from outside the country and working cross-border. That is becoming an increasingly difficult thing to do because the complexity of the environment, the communications within the environment, and the day-to-day judgments which my colleagues and I are making every day about the safety, security and access of humanitarian assistance are increasingly sensitive. When I started off working in Somalia in the early 1990s, it wasn't easy by any stretch of the imagination, but you sat down and you talked through with different faction leaders, different groups, different communities, how we were going to work, how we were going to reach communities, how we were going to work in a way which was impartial. Now, and if you made that agreement, it was likely to hold for a few days, maybe even weeks. Now, you have the Thuraya number, you have the sat phone number of different faction leaders, and maybe that agreement will stick for a few hours a day at most. So just that complexity means it's much more difficult. Also, I think in a very positive way, and programs like the ones you're all part of have really contributed to this. The standards that we set ourselves, I believe, are much higher, and that's absolutely right. I grew up professionally through the era of the sphere standards being seen as a bit of a revolution. Now they're seen as the absolute basics, and my goodness, you know, if you're only meeting them, then, you know, think harder. But I think we are genuinely making progress as a relatively embryonic sector in these terms, only in these terms, embryonic, towards really pushing ourselves in terms of the professionalisation debate, in terms of certification of humanitarian response. And I'm very happy to talk about all of these things because I know they're things that you're looking at a lot. And for the record, Oxfam does think that certification of humanitarian organisations is a good thing. In this country, if you want your water system fixing, you go to a certified plumber. Why should the fact that your house has fallen down as a result of the Haiti earthquake mean that you don't have a right to go to a certified organisation to have your water system fixed? Why should you be dependent on somebody who just turns up and goes, well, I'd really kind of like to fix it, and I think I can do it. You know, it's a respect and it's a dignity and right thing. It's not just a practical thing. So that's the case for change, and you can challenge me on that. You can say that it's not the case, but that's my opening bid, if you like. And this is just a small snapshot of, I'm not sure what all these things that keep on popping up are. I don't mind, as long as they keep on saying great. If something comes up that says rubbish, then we're an issue. But, oh, right, okay. Oh, right. Okay. Oh, right. Oh, don't worry, it's quite interesting, isn't it? So this is just a small pictorial representation of what the environment that we work in as humanitarians looks like. And if you look at it, just that little bit on the left-hand side is labelled humanitarian. And that is the bit which says, right, okay, let's help you get through until tomorrow. But look at the overlapping issues, all of which on various occasions have an impact on humanitarian response, and humanitarian response has an impact on. So how you deliver that humanitarian assistance today can have a serious impact on the chances of early recovery for the people affected by that humanitarian crisis, whether they are living in an increasingly stable or a less stable environment. Is it going to contribute towards peace building, or can you actually exacerbate conflict? Yes, of course you can exacerbate conflict by inappropriate and ill thought out humanitarian response. And I'm very happy to talk about occasions where I think the humanitarian sector has done that, and places where I think we have genuinely delivered in ways that have supported peace building. But the point is, it's part of the overall thinking. And you do, as a sort of very practical humanitarian, occasionally reach moments where you just feel that you are looking at such a complicated situation that you almost can't move. And that is, I think, even worse, because that means nobody actually gets help at all. And so, for example, last year, I was still being arguably correctly challenged, and we were still continuing a debate amongst those organisations who now, nearly 20 years ago, in 1996 in Eastern Congo, had worked in the refugee camps in Eastern Congo after the Rwandan genocide. And there is still an active debate as to whether or not continuing to work in those camps had directly contributed to an opportunity for regroupment and resurgence in certain armed groups, or had it genuinely kept women and children alive who would not otherwise be there. And that is still a very live debate. And that debate is still happening on a daily basis. How do we in South Sudan right now make sure that the communities in which we work are receiving assistance according to their needs and not according to the political astuteness of the groups that might be working in those communities? And that is a daily conversation for my colleagues and I. And there's no doubt, I think we get it right on many occasions, but sometimes we will get it wrong. And at what stage does a combatant become a non-combatant and back again? You know, I was there at the end of the rainy season a couple of weeks ago, where there were people who were looking after their families, who were only receiving one meal a day, who were living in buildings, public buildings and churches, and living in compounds with 20 people living there where really there should have been 5. Now, there's no doubt some of those people we were talking to probably by now, given that it's not Manchester and it has stopped raining in South Sudan, will be actively involved in the conflict. Now, how do we stop the accusation that we have actually enabled them to go out and do that? Well, there are some very practical things we can do in terms of direct delivery to women and children and so on, but it won't be 100%. So this is the complex environment within which we live. The good news is that within this increasingly turbulent and complex world, there is a steady upward trend in the amount of direct resources available for the increasing number of people who on a daily basis find themselves in need of humanitarian assistance. And it's very difficult to really pin down the metrics on how much is available, but this is a reasonable, this is taken from the HCRI, the Humanitarian Response Index, which we use. I don't know what you think about it. We think it's as good a piece of research as any in terms of assessing how much humanitarian assistance is available globally. So good news is, in theory, there is more financial assistance available for humanitarian response available on a year-by-year basis. However, the bad news is that there are more and more people in need of that. And it's very difficult. My goodness, now here's a challenge for you, if anybody can step up to this one. How we can actually assess what the likely projections are for the growth in the number of people in need of some form of humanitarian response, either as a result of natural disaster or conflict. The best way we can think we've concluded of looking at it is looking at how far the global multi-hazard indicator is going up. So the areas that are deepest red are areas which between now and 2030 are likely to experience a greater level of humanitarian hazard, whether through natural disaster or conflict, and thus an increase in the amount of humanitarian assistance actually needed. So the bad news is that this map shows a level of need which is growing at a much higher rate than the level of resources available, which means that if you put the two together, need is going up like that, and response or resources available for response is going up at a much lesser slope. And basically that growing gap between need and response is what we are looking at. And there's a lot of debate going on in the humanitarian sector, as you probably know, about how we fill that gap. And there are some who would say that we simply need to make the current ways of delivering that assistance work better. And there's no doubt about it. There are significant amounts of efficiency and so on that we could get. But our view from Oxfam, and this is what I'm now getting into running past you, our thinking, is that we really don't think that simply making the current system work harder is going to deliver that level of exponential growth. So for those of you for whom sort of silly trite pictures work, and I am one of those people, if you're not one of those people, then you can just forget this next slide. We think we need to get from this, which is, as the more astute amongst you will recognise, a very early bicycle. It's recognisable as a bicycle in that it's got 2 wheels and some pedals, and you sit on it and you will move forward. However, you can pedal this ancient bicycle as hard as you like, and you can be as fit as you like, and it's not going to go as fast as this, which is a modern mountain bike. So what we want to do is we want to take those basic principles of humanitarianism, the fact that you have a basic right to humanitarian assistance, all of us do, and that assistance should be delivered impartially and according to universal standards that are not dependent on who you are and where you are, but just on your being human. But we need to really shift how it's delivered to be more efficient and to really be able to increase the likelihood of you receiving that humanitarian assistance exponentially, so that the world can rely more soundly on humanitarian assistance being in the right place at the right time. How do we do this? We think it's a pretty simple idea, really. This is a different way of looking at the world, a very basic way of looking at states. On the far left-hand side, you have very fragile and conflict-affected states, and at the right-hand side you have established global powers. But more interestingly, as you move into that second pyramid from the right, you have the growing number of emerging global powers who are thriving and growing, and who are increasingly willing and able to take up their state responsibilities for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to their citizens. Now, the way we would like to see the world work is that our humanitarian vision and principles should be universal, but our application of them should be context-driven and specific. So what that means is that in those countries where there is an increasing growth in the economy and where there is the political growth to take on state-based responsibilities, then the role of organisations like Oxfam, like the UN agencies, should significantly shift so that we are supporting and engaging as channels of support with the organisations of the state and civil society, so that we can then free up traditional resources, if you like, to invest in that far left-hand side in the fragile states, where very sadly in South Sudan, in DRC, in those places, the most likely situation for the hundreds of thousands of people who find themselves driven from their homes, either by natural disaster or conflict, is to rely on people like us. And it's only by that that we are really going to get that exponential growth. But it's got some real challenges for the traditional humanitarian system, and we need to make sure that we pick them up. So the opportunities, if we get this serious shift in investment right is that not only will there be a reduction in the number of people experiencing humanitarian crisis because they will be supported by their own governments and by their own civil society, but those who will receive assistance will do so through stronger relationships with people closer to them. There will be local growth, which really means that people receive assistance more speedily and more effectively, and that there will be liberated capacity of the international system to focus on those areas where local capacity simply isn't feasible. So, for example, I'm going to give you some more case studies to try and make sense of this in a moment. But last year in the Philippines, after Cyclone Haiyan, Oxfam did a traditional humanitarian response, to be honest. It was an unprecedented event, as you probably know, in the history of the Philippines, in the history of the global crises. You know, it was the strongest storm ever to make landfall. And so Oxfam, along with pretty much every other major international humanitarian NGO and UN agency and donor government, we mounted our traditional response. We had a long-term program in the Philippines, so it wasn't out of nowhere. It was based on, you know, long-term relationships in the Philippines, but it involved setting up new offices. It involved input of resources from this country, from our major stores of equipment in Oxfordshire. It involved massive local recruitment. It involved deploying our global expert staff. And it was a good thing. You know, there is no doubt about it. Over 500,000 people, just as a result of Oxfam, and we're only one of many, got something that helped them get over those first few weeks and into the future. However, if we're serious about shifting our own involvement in the Philippines, which is a government which is really keen to take up its responsibilities, then when the next Haiyan happens, as climate change and the other forces of increasing crisis suggest it will, if that happens again in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time, and we're still doing the same response, that will be a failure on our part. In 5 years' time, what we want to be doing, and what we've already started shifting to do, is we will be, yes, if asked, we will offer global expertise and we'll offer fundraising from the UK public and so on, but we'll put those into a locally structured and locally managed system, and by so doing, we'll reduce the transaction costs. We will enable people to receive assistance faster and more efficiently, and in a way which they've been part of designing before the crisis happens. That may sound all very pie in the sky, but we've started already. So we held back £2 million of the £10 million that we raised from the UK public for Haiyan, and it was all written in the appeal, so no legal worries on that front. We held back £2 million to invest in that local capacity for the future. And we have to do that more, because it's only by doing that that we can really get that engaged growth. There are difficulties. Believe it, the arguments we had over holding back that, both moral and practical arguments about holding back that £2 million in the Philippines, was really, really difficult. Really difficult. Because you're actually saying that's £2 million that we're not going to spend on helping people today in order to help them for the longer term. How do you get the balance right? That's a big moral and practical question. I'd love to know your thoughts on it, and please disagree with me as much as you like. How do we make sure that principles and quality aren't compromised as things are developed? Are we saying to people, for example in the Philippines, well, actually, while this sort of development thing is going on, we could offer you something of a really high standard, but it's going to be a slightly not such great standard this time because we're investing in the future. we all take time to sort of develop, and that could be a real issue. How do we, and this is a very much a practical question for an organisation like Oxfam, how do we maintain different identities? How do we stay as in the Philippines, in Kenya, in Indonesia, in Mozambique, in Latin America? How do we become that supportive, supportive and facilitating organisation, while at the same time still being the sort of the deliverers of assistance in Eastern DRC, in South Sudan, in Afghanistan? It's a really, you know, in a global marketplace where, you know, for example, when I and my colleagues went to Damascus to talk about setting up our program in Damascus, we met with the Ministry of Water, who are in, you know, a technical ministry in the government of Syria, but we have to talk to them about, we end up talking to all sorts of people about establishing our presence. And we thought we'd made this very clear balance that we felt that working from Damascus, as I say, was going to be an effective way of reaching people across the conflict lines in Syria. And so far it's working. But we thought, I wonder what they think about us as a campaigning organisation as well as a straight technical water delivery organisation. And we spoke to them about it, and we said, well, you know, after a couple of days of this debate and going past, we said, you do know who we are? And they just looked at us as though we'd sort of, you know, sort of lost the plot. And we went, of course we know who you are. You know, we know exactly what you do, and that's common knowledge. So it's very difficult to hold multiple identities in different countries as one organisation. How do you convey that you are genuinely impartial and principled if you look different in different places, if you look like a sort of organisational development specialist in the Philippines and you look like a direct humanitarian implementer in Goma and in Congo? They're very different things, and it's a phenomenally difficult thing to hold. And then you go to the UK public, or you go to the public in the US through Oxfam America, or you go to, you know, through Oxfam Netherlands, and you try and explain to your public and your supporters that you're doing all these things in different ways in different places, and you're saying, trust us, we'll get the balance right. That's a really complex message to give to people. Is it possible? So our vision remains that we really want to move on from being purely a response and development organisation to being something much more nuanced, where people can genuinely foresee disasters and prepare, where states fulfil their obligations. And there aren't many NGOs in the UK who talk about the role of the state, to be honest, but we're willing to put our heads out and say that. Women in particular have their rights upheld even in crises, and that is, again, challenging us massively in terms of what we do and how we do it. Do we work only through women's organisations? Do we work more generally? But, and this is the real challenge for us, how do we do all of that, but when there really is no other option, we will be delivering humanitarian assistance? So that's what we're going to do in order to achieve that. I'm going to just pause because I always think it's nice to be able to read a slide every so often. And we've already started on this path. And these two slides are just to suggest to you why we think this stands a reasonable chance of working. These two lines represent Oxfam GB's income over the last 10 years. So the pink one is our total income spent on humanitarian work and development work, And the purple one is how much we spend on humanitarian assistance. It's a pretty dull graph, so let's move on from it. So the key thing I want you to take away from that is that actually we're growing steadily, but it's not, it's jolly difficult to grow in the UK market at the moment. And we're not doing badly, but it's staying pretty stable. But that's what's happened to the number of people our humanitarian assistance has helped in the last 10 years. We've managed, basically, with the same amount of money to assist many more people. And this growth in beneficiary numbers has been achieved largely by working not just as deliverers, but as supporters and facilitators, primarily in Asia. And that's because, to go back to the original slides that I was showing you about, the sort of changing environment, the growth of civil society in Asia in the last 10 years has been phenomenal. And so there have been civil society partners who we can work in support of, who can work more efficiently and more effectively than a northern-based organisation, and that's where you manage to reach more people. And the sort of the example I quote still, even though the second bit is a little bit out of date, but it shows that you can do it in 5 years, which goes back to my Philippines example of we must change in the next 5 years even more. In 2004, at the beginning of the Darfur crisis, it really stretched Oxfam organisationally to help 500,000 people in Darfur, where we were doing humanitarian response as a direct implementer, sending people, recruiting people, delivering stuff. In 2010, just 5 years later, in the Pakistan floods, which you may remember were absolutely cataclysmic that year, we reached nearly 2 million people, and it wasn't easy, but it didn't break us in the way that, or it didn't stretch us in the way that 500,000 had 5 years previously in Darfur. And that was because we were working through and with local organisations. And that's how we would really like to see the humanitarian sector as a whole change. So this is a case study of how we will continue to work in places like the fragile states, like South Sudan and so on. Here are people employed by Oxfam and delivering different sorts of assistance, whether it's cash, whether it's food, whether it's water, because that is the only way that those people are going to have their rights fulfilled. However, just over the border in Kenya, and I'd love to talk about this lots more, but I'll just give you a brief introduction here. We are part of the Hunger Safety Net programme, which is a government-led programme whereby I think it's 374,000 families are registered by a government agency across northern Kenya as potentially in need of assistance during bad climatic years in northern Kenya. And earlier this year, 100,000 of those families were identified as in need of some sort of help because the short rains last year failed, and in the event that the long rains failed in 2014, they would have been pushed really into humanitarian crisis. Fortunately, they didn't, but they were sort of hovering on the brink. What happened in January and February this year was that those families received a small government payout supported by donor governments, supported by NGOs, and led by the government of Kenya, which contributed significantly to them not falling off the edge in March and April. And the investment, there were lots of problems with this program, let's be perfectly honest, I'm happy to talk about them, because it was a trial run, if you like. But my goodness, it's an awful lot better than people being in abject need and being dependent on food handouts. Instead, they received a level of cash which kept local markets going and which enabled people to get through a difficult time. And that, basically, the investment that we made in that, which helped in some way 100,000 families, we reckon was about the same as the investment we made in 2011 when there was a huge food crisis across East Africa, and where we think in northern Kenya we probably helped about 8,000 families who were really in acute need by the time we got to help them. So this is about early investment and investment through existing local structures being much more efficient and having a greater impact. So what does this mean for people like all of us in the room who are either in a humanitarian career or are thinking about one? Well, it means that we will still definitely look like a whole range of different people. People who run a business, people who campaign for change, who don't just deliver it but who influence others. People who carry out research. People who have a technical expertise, who can communicate, who can fundraise. And this is somebody writing a fundraising proposal in Port-au-Prince after the earthquake when half of our office had fallen down. But above all, people who are facilitators. And I know this might be something that you would like to talk about in more detail, and I'm really happy to do so. But at the time I started out, which, given my grey hairs, is now sort of 25 years ago, I think the humanitarian world was full of people who had a good heart and knew how to do something. It's very different now. Humanitarianism and humanitarian organisations are not a career in themselves. They're an environment in which you do what you're good at. So whether you're a technical expert or whether you are a manager or a business support analyst or a researcher, it's applying those skills within a humanitarian context. And that's part of the professionalisation of humanitarianism, I think. And I see that as overwhelmingly a very positive move, but it's challenging for all of us because it means that we are working in a much wider and more complex world, and just doing something isn't enough. It's about really being the best you possibly can and meeting that high level of professional expertise which you are then able to do in arguably some of the most difficult environments in the world. Also managers, sorry, I forgot that. That's what I do, and I'd miss myself off it. So I would love to know what you feel. I think it's really important that we have this conversation. Do you think, and this is what I'm sort of shamelessly using being here to ask you, do you think it's right that in order to come and work for an organisation like Oxfam, like Save the Children, like UNICEF, you not only know how humanitarian principles work, how the humanitarian sector works, but that you actually have a professional certificate? I often say I am not qualified for the job I do. The only technical qualification I have actually is to be an archaeologist, which is what I did, sort of 30 years ago, which basically I'm qualified to be an archaeologist and a grave digger because they're the only two jobs for which the only qualification is the ability to dig a hole with straight sides. I never did a humanitarian qualification, and yet I do this job and have done it for 25 years. I would like to think that starting off afresh, I would really be able to sort of demonstrate to people, whether it's, I don't know, the head of the Disaster Management Authority in Laos or Cambodia, or a very difficult local somebody or other in in Zambia that I am qualified for what I do. Is that right? I don't know. I'd love to know what you think. I'm part of a group of organisations. I'm a representative of Oxfam in a group of organisations who are developing a certification system which we hope will be as appropriate to a small embryonic local organisation in southern Indonesia as it is to Care International based in Atlanta. That means that you can have a piece of paper that you can stick to a tree in whatever disaster it is you're working in, saying, we are competent to do the following things, we are not competent to do the other things. And something we think, if we get it right, that will mean that that small local organisation can say, look, we're as qualified to put in this water system as this big international organisation, and what's more, we're here faster and we're here cheaper. Can we make that work? There are lots of debates going on that front as well, and I would love to know what you think about them, because I know you look at them during the course of your research and study. But I think this is as much about upholding people's rights as having declarations and treaties and what have you. It's having that commitment to growing southern capacity and being able to demonstrate that it is just as good as people who, if you like, have been running organisations like Oxfam since 1942. So those are the challenges, I think, for those of us who are working in the sector, but the characteristics will remain the same. It's going to continue to be a very chaotic environment, and we need to be very tolerant of that ambiguity. We've got to accept letting go much more. We can't be control freaks. We have to take risks. We have to really invest in those long-term relationships. We need to make decisions quickly. We're making decisions on an hourly basis at the moment as to how Oxfam can best support the international effort to overcome Ebola in West Africa, which is particularly challenging when we're not a medical agency, so we can't contribute that. But we can contribute an ability to put in decent water supplies to health centres. How can we do that? We need to be much more effective at communicating and negotiating. We need to be able to prioritise. We need to know who we are and who we're not. And we need to really clarify where the sector is going in future. And that means building those partnerships where sometimes the humanitarian sector hasn't been great in the past. And that's going to mean working with very limited information, but taking the plunge and saying, right, this is how we're going to change and this is what we're going to do it. So that's a whole raft of ideas. I hope some of them have appealed to you. I would love to know what you think, but thank you for listening anyway.